Good afternoon. I'm David Tunick, President of the IFPDA, and it's a distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce our very distinguished speaker, my longtime friend, Susan Dackerman. Her presentation is entitled Dürer's Prints and the Islamic East, and it is brought to you by the Print Council of America, thank you very much, in partnership with the IFPDA. Susan's subject today is all the more significant, of course, and timely, given the current tragic war in the Mideast. The Mamluks and the Ottomans went to war in proximity to the same area in 1485 to 1491. Their war was not only a battle for control of the spice trade, but also for territory, including control of the holy cities of Islam. All of this was contemporary with the young Albrecht Dürer. In enlightening us on a subject most of us know so little about, Susan will concentrate on a small number of the most puzzling and intriguing images to come out of the German Renaissance. And they are Dürer's engraving of the sea monster, one of his very few etchings, the landscape with a cannon, and his series of knots in woodcut. A short synopsis of Susan's impressive background and very long CV. A graduate of Vassar, Susan earned her master's and doctorate in art history at Bryn Mawr. She was director of the museum at Stanford, and prior to that had made enormous contributions as a curator, professor, fellow, and scholar at a number of institutions, including the Getty, Harvard, the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, National Gallery, Washington, Baltimore Museum, USC, Maryland Institute, College of Art, the list could go on and on. Her scholarly publications, books, articles, exhibition catalogues are too numerous to list here, but they include many on Durer, a catalog Raisonné of Jasper John's Monotypes, Prints in the Pursuit of Knowledge in Early Modern Europe, and one of my favorites that in fact has a permanent place on my desk, Painted Prints, The Revelation of Color in Northern Renaissance Baroque Engravings, Etchings, and Woodcuts. Before we turn this over to Susan, may we ask that you hold your questions until the end of the presentation when we allow time for a Q&A. So Susan, the mic is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I want to thank Print Council and the IFPDA for the chance to talk about the, this book that I have written that is now in production. I am going to talk about something in this fair that is the fair is primarily contemporary. And I'm going to take you back to the very beginning of printing, which I think deserves a different story than the one that we have been telling. And I think it's a story that's more global, and there were intercontinental and inter-empire networks of exchange, so hopefully you will bear with me on this. Now, I'm not an Islamicist by training, by any stretch of the imagination, and I don't really have anything new to offer in terms of knowledge about Islamic art or cultural production. But I am very interested in print culture and the power that print culture has and what print culture does. So, there we go. So what got me interested in this initially was my curiosity about the number of prints by Albrecht Dürer that included Muslim figures or Islamic subject matter. And very little has been written in that area. Julian Raby wrote a great book in 1986, but for the most part, the figures are treated as being exotic, that they are something to kind of fill gaps in Durer's artistic and visual imagination. And I want to tell a story in which not only is Durer's inclusion of these Muslim figures entirely intentional and really well informed, but that they were completely legible to his contemporaries. That what these prints represent are events, stories, incidents that his generation would have known, and these prints would not have been as mysterious to them as they are to us, essentially. So even a print like this from Durer's Life of the Virgin series, you see the three magi presenting the Virgin and the Christ child with their gifts. But in the background, there is an Ottoman military figure astride a horse. And we know he's Ottoman from the star and moon flag and the bifurcated sword flag, which were identifiers of Muslim culture, or the Ottoman Empire. And it's a really curious image because, of course, the birth of Christ happens in, the year 0 common time. And the Ottoman Empire is formed in 1299, established. So the components of this image are 1,300 years out of kilter. But Durer knows at this moment that the Holy Land is under the control of the Mamluk Sultanate. During Durer's lifetime, there were two very powerful Islamic empires that were important within the Holy Roman Empire, the Mamluk Sultanate and the Ottoman Empire. And the Mamluks at this time controlled the Holy Land. Now, the Mamluks, the empire was constituted of slaves, mostly enslaved Christians who had been brought to become part of this empire that was based in Egypt, Syria, and what we think of now as West Asia. There was, in this moment, the hope that maybe the Mamluk Empire, because it was packed with converted Christians, might turn it over to Christian Europe, the Holy Land. And I think we see a little hint of that in the Asian king on his knees. He's taken his turban off, the key identifier of Muslim identity. It's put aside, kneeling in a gesture of prayer in front of the Virgin and Child. The Ottoman Empire was always on the heels of the Mamluks, trying to take that territory from them. And I think that that's why we have the Ottoman figure in the background. So Durer is very aware of the geopolitics of his moment. And I think it gets represented in these images that he makes, in these printed images that he makes. Here is the celestial chart of the northern hemisphere. In the bottom right-hand corner, the primary Arabic astronomer, Al-Sufi, is represented. I mean, it's not an accident. Durer was immersed in astronomy and knowledgeable, and of course, if he was going to include Ptolemy, he had to include Al-Sufi. So a lot of the point of this work that I've been doing is trying to figure out who knew what at Durer's time, in Durer's time, about the Islamic world. Almost 10% of his printed images actually include a Muslim figure or something related to the Islamic East. Now, I haven't counted how many Virgin and Child images he did, but I bet you it's about the same. And we know a lot about those prints. But we haven't really looked at these prints with the same, with the same eye towards teasing out the history. So thinking about all these Muslim subjects in his early prints, I got stuck on the historical coincidence of the invention of printing, or at least the development of printing, in Germany by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-1450s. It's a very significant moment in our history, of course, in Western history. And in 1453, the Ottoman Empire took Constantinople. And while we have an idea of, what that means, there was that song of my parents' generation, Istanbul was Constantinople. Do people know that song? Because then They Might Be Giants did it again in the 90s. It runs through my head while I do this work all the time. Istanbul was Constantinople. But when Istanbul was Constantinople, Constantinople was the seat of Christendom in the East. So we had Christians in Rome, in Europe, but then there was this very potent seat of Christendom in the East. Once that was taken over by the Ottoman Empire and that region became predominantly Islamic, it changed so much about how people were able to move between continents. Just the geopolitics of the moment were revolutionary and coincided precisely with Gutenberg's invention. So, we're all taught that the first publication that Gutenberg printed was the Bible. It's not quite true. Before he printed the Bible, he printed this publication, which was a call to crusade against the Ottoman Empire. There's only one, it's a short pamphlet, it doesn't have any images in it. There's only one copy left in the library in Munich. And it pretty much asks that the Pope and all the rulers of Europe get together to combat the Ottoman and Mamluk empires. Before Gutenberg prints this, he prints indulgences. And those indulgences were intended to raise funds to combat the Ottoman Empire. So you pay into the papal pot. You don't have to spend as long in purgatory or wherever else you may be going. And it's a good opportunity to raise for fundraising towards fighting the Ottoman Empire. So early printing, to my mind, is all mixed up with the Islamic world. I don't think that we can tell the story that we've been telling for generations now without including the Muslim world. So it's a big topic. So I decided to look at it through the lens of Albrecht Dürer. And what I do is look at three very particular print projects that he did. His 1498 Meerwunder, which in English is known as the Sea Monster, the 1507 series of woodcuts called the Knots, and finally his landscape with cannon. And what I do is treat the three media that he worked most commonly in, woodcut, engraving, and etching, because I think for Dürer, that choice of medium was really important to the topic. For instance, landscape with cannon. The development of etching, I don't know how many of you were at the panel discussion before this talk, but the development of etching is very closely tied to the development of artillery. It is in the production of gunpowder, the use of saltpeter that gets processed to make gunpowder, and the byproduct of the saltpeter is nitric acid, which in fact becomes the acid by which artists and others can etch copper. I think Durer knows this. And so I think his inclusion of the artillery in his last major etching that actually depicts an Ottoman figure, because of course the development of artillery is very much about this inter-empire warfare that's happening at the moment. So the book focuses on these three particular prints. The sea monster, which is what we call this print in English, is called in German Meerwunder. And I think sea monster is actually a mistranslation. And it's a mistranslation that goes back to Vasari. When he wrote about the print, he called the print something about a marine monster taking this woman, abducting this woman. But I think if we think about the title that Durer gave it, Meerwunder translates more as marine marvel. And there was a lot going on in the Mediterranean at this time that was actually really marvelous, around trade, around political exchange. There was a lot. So I'm not going to talk about this print now, but it's in the book, and I don't think it's a sea monster. I think that it's a marine marvel. But today, and this is the canon with a drawing from which the figure is drawn. But I'm just going to skip ahead to the knots, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So let me just take a step back and tell you a little bit about Durer for those of you who are not as immersed in his life and work as others of you. So Durer was the great artist of the Renaissance north of the Alps. He was from Nuremberg, which was a very important city within the Holy Roman Empire. It was a free imperial city. It was a site of great industrial or proto-industrial manufacture. Durer was the son of a goldsmith who had traveled to Nuremberg because Nuremberg was such an important site for processing metals. And so Durer was initially trained as a metalsmith. His skills at visual representation emerged very young in his life. On the left is a drawing that he made, a self-portrait, when he was 13 years old. I mean, he just had astounding skills. He was also a very prolific writer. So Durer is someone we know a lot about because he's written treatises on geometry and measurement and fortifications and proportion, and he's written letters and he's kept diaries. So there's a lot there to know about him. And so these stories about him get told. Now, something like the Adam and Eve engraving is probably something that you know well by Durer. And it's interesting to me because what we think about the Adam and Eve is that everything he's done there is entirely intentional. So it's about the fall of man, as we know. Adam is standing on the tail of a mouse who, once he shifts his weight, is going to be caught by a cat. There are other animals immersed there in the woods. And then at the top of the cliff, at the top right, there's a goat that looks like it's about to fall or jump. All of these inclusions, all of these details are really intentional. And my point is, so why would Durer have included something as specific as inhabitants of the Islamic world without having some intention behind it? The story that gets told mostly about the prints and drawings of Islamic subjects is that he goes to Venice. Durer went to Venice twice. He met Bellini. Bellini had gone as an ambassador to Istanbul, and while he was there, he made lots of drawings and sketches, And when he and Durer meet in Venice, he gives Durer the opportunity to copy some of those drawings and paintings. And here you see one of Bellini's most important paintings and the drawing that Durer made of 3 figures from that painting. Well, those 3 figures, I don't have a pointer, but they're tucked way, way in the back. They're really hard to find in the painting. So Durer sees this painting. It has 3 Muslim figures in it, in this sea of Christians, and he draws the 3 Muslim guys. It's all very intentional. And then he goes back to that drawing 20 years later when he, in fact, makes the canon etching. So it's all about intentionality here, for me. Okay, so this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the knots. And the knots are a series of 6 woodcuts that I think are some of the most beautiful prints that the artist has ever made. I think that the carving of the wood blocks is exemplary. And one of the wood blocks survives. It's in a museum in Bautzen in Germany. But a few years ago, probably pre-COVID now, I can't remember, it was in a show at the Metropolitan called Fashion and Virtue that Femke Spielberg did. And we all got to see it if we got to see the show. And it's the kind of thing where you can really see like the detail of the carving and how, what an amazing object it is that engenders these woodcuts. So here's the typical story of these woodcuts. They're based on a series of engravings that were done by Leonardo da Vinci. And the designs are based on embroidery work or lace work. Now, that Durer made these prints, these 6 woodcuts, has been doubted by different art historians. Even the great Durer scholar Erwin Panofsky says, I'm not really sure about these woodcuts, and pretty much leaves it at that. And they're doubted because they're not signed, because Durer never made anything that was white lines on a black ground like this. So they were very unusual. He had never copied another artist. He had never done anything that seemed so purely decorative and ornamental. But I don't think that they were decorative and ornamental. I think that they have a lot more meaning than that. And the other thing to keep in mind about them is that I think he made them because they're noted in one of his diaries. And he says that he gave these 6 prints to the dean of the Artist Guild in Antwerp, which was probably the most important artists' guild of the time. So Durer, who was always trying to enhance his reputation, would not have given prints that he didn't think were exemplary to the head of this guild, Dirk Wellert, who also makes prints. So that's the background on the prints. So here I'm showing you the Durer on the right and the Leonardo, or the school of Leonardo engraving, on the left. And you can see within the central medallion that it says Accademia de Leonardo, which is how they have become attached to Leonardo, which is also questionable. But Durer made pretty precise copies of them. Carmen Bambach has measured them precisely. So it seems as if they got traced and transferred from to a woodblock by Durer. Durer changes them somewhat. He encloses the circle. Here's another pair. He encloses the circle. He attaches the corner pieces. So in the Leonardo engraving, the corner pieces are just floating out there around the central image. And in some instances where impressions of this print have been preserved, they have been cut off. Like the National Gallery has one of Leonardo's knots where the central form is glued down or mounted, and then the 4 corner pieces are mounted. They're disconnected except for the mount. Durer ensures that that's not going to happen by attaching them. And he also does something that's seemingly minor, but I think is ultimately important. He adds those calligraphic flourishes around the corner pieces. So while they're very similar, they now look a little different. Now, someone got a hold of the blocks after Durer died and decided to enhance their value, probably as well as the block's value, by adding Durer's monogram to the central medallions on the blocks. So posthumous impressions have Durer's monogram. But various art historians have decided that it's not, in fact, an authentic monogram of Durer, that it's added later. And they're all on impressions on later paper. So here I'm showing you the woodcut knot next to the wood block from which it was printed. So just in a very simplified way, in fact, it's embarrassing to say this because there are probably artists in the audience, but to make a wood block, an artist takes a sharp carving tool, gouges the wood, makes the design, and the ink is actually applied to the surface of the block. So even though this is a block that's totally black from centuries of ink being applied and soaked into it, what has been gouged away from the surface appears white in the woodcut. And you can see how rough the gouges are around the design. And it's really interesting because, of course, what is printed isn't raised that high. It's just a couple of millimeters. I mean, this block was actually kind of astounding to see how much it betrayed about Durer's process here. So this is one of the blocks, and that's what you get when you print from it. So I think that these woodcuts tell as much of a story about exchange and travel and trade and natural resources as a figurative image. He's just done it in a kind of diagrammatic way. And so this map that's admittedly not very good, you could see Nuremberg and Venice is below that, and it opens out onto the Mediterranean Sea. So Durer went to Venice twice. And a very important site in Venice for German artists as well as German merchants and industrialists was the Fondaco de Tedeschi. It was a warehouse, living space, showroom for goods that were moving between Germany and the Holy Roman Empire and Venice. So Venice's trade economy was very well regulated. They told everyone who wasn't Venetian how to behave. I mean, they told the Venetians how to behave too, but they didn't keep them as contained in this one building. So German merchants would bring goods from places like Nuremberg, Durer's hometown, to the Fondaco. Then they would get put on Venetian ships, moved into the Mediterranean, and sold around the Mediterranean. So it was a very important site. The figure you see on the left is the architect who designed the building after it burned down in the beginning of the 16th century, and a new one was built in 1506, 1507. You can still go to this building in Venice. It's on the northeastern side of the Grand Canal, just above the Rialto Bridge. And incredibly enough, it is still very much this site of exchange, except instead of like the Fuggers being there and the Tookers, now Louis Vuitton is there, and all the Pradas there, all the high design comes and goes from the Fundaco still. So I'm intrigued by this drawing of the architect because it's on Venetian or Italian paper that's probably Venetian. And Durer didn't use a lot of Italian paper because he thought the paper that was made in Nuremberg was as good as any paper made in Italy. But he makes this drawing on Venetian paper. And he also prints the earliest knots on Venetian paper, which I think tie them into this site of exchange and what's happening through Venice. He also makes them right after he gets back from Venice. So I think one of the things he saw when he was in Venice was this type of metalwork that was made in the Mamluk Sultanate in Syria and Egypt, that was cast brass with silver filigree inlay. I think Leonardo saw it as well. And Leonardo copied it, made his engravings. Durer goes to Venice, sees the same kind of metalwork, knows Leonardo or the Leonardo School engravings and says, I could do this better than he can. I can make copies of these Mamluk metalware vessels that better replicate their physicality, their meaning, and all of it. These are more examples of them. The style is called Veneto-Saracenic. And it was called that because for generations, scholars thought that it was made in Venice by Muslim artisans. But it turns out that that wasn't the case. That in fact, what was happening was that metal was being made in Central Europe, mostly in Germany. It was getting shipped to Venice, and then it would get carried to the Mamluk Sultanate where it would get decorated. It would get put back on a Venetian ship and brought back to Venice. The Germans would pick it up, bring it up into Central Europe and sell it there. If you go into museums throughout Europe, there's a lot of this metalwork. And I think it's very, so its relationship to this print, I hope, even though the slides here aren't great, is visible. So I'm just going to talk about the metal industries in Central Europe a bit. So in the 14th century, a lot of mining and metal processing was done in Central Europe, especially in Germany. And it was, all of these new techniques were developed, and these books were written for how to extract metal from mines, how to process it, and Durer's hometown was like the center of this event. And I think we see it in lots of his prints. So like Melancholia is filled with these objects, these specialty metal objects, many of them brass, that were made in Durer's hometown. The scales, the nails on the ground, all of it. So Durer is aware of what's happening in his hometown. So again, just this metalwork, the natural resources are being mined in Central Europe, shipped to Nuremberg where it's processed, back to Venice, and it's moving now around the Mediterranean. So it has a really global, international feel to it. So when I saw that block at the Metropolitan, and I looked closely at the cut lines, and I was thinking about how the lines are always described as designs for embroidery or lace. I thought, they don't look like embroidery or lace, they actually look like wire. That Durer has cut this narrow channel alongside the wider line to give those lines real three-dimensionality. So in this knot, you could actually see it better because it's a rectilinear rather than a curvilinear design. And you can kind of see how rigid those lines are in the way that they kind of break, not fold over one another. They're up and down. This is not pliable yarn or thread being depicted. And then, of course, it looks like Leonardo did it too. So the primary lines of Leonardo's design also have that narrow channel next to them so that the lines look three-dimensional. And the thing about the Leonardo is that those pendants in the center, especially this one you can see, is actually held by a ribbon. And you can tell the difference between the floppiness of the ribbon and the sturdiness of the wire. Like, so Leonardo or whoever in his school made these knew that too. So the big question is, why does Durer care about this wire? Because even when you look at the lines next to the tendrils that go around the corner pieces, you can tell the lines in the center of the ornament are really rigid and ornamental and regimented. And then around, it looks like natural growth, the way a vine would grow or a sprouting tendril would look. And he does that very intentionally. So, again, why does he care so much about wire? Well, it turns out that during Durer's lifetime, there were 30 mills that made wire around Nuremberg. So we know this drawing that Durer made probably in 1494, maybe a little earlier. And it depicts a wire mill on the banks of the Pegnitz River. And there were over 30 of these right in his neighborhood. So wire was a major commodity being produced in Durer's hometown. And that was the case because in Durer's hometown, they devised this technology to produce the wire. And you can see, I don't have a pointer here, but you can see the water mill creates the power that would have turned a camshaft, that would have turned gears. And hopefully you can see the two spools. And between those two spools is a length of wire. And the way that wire was made was metal was taken and it was pulled through progressively smaller holes by this machine to make finer and finer wire. This is happening everywhere around Durer. Now, Nuremberg also had made the previous great invention in wire production, which was this swing that the wire swing puller used. So what you see on the right is a monk who made wire. And he made wire by sitting on a swing, pulling himself forward, grabbing hold of the wire to pull through those apertures on that panel, and then letting the momentum created by the gravity of the swing help him pull that wire through. I mean, to see this in person, you could see the exertion all over this guy's face. Like, this is not easy. But in Nuremberg, they had been doing this for a century before they invent the water mill with the camshaft and all of that. So Nuremberg has cornered the market on wire production, and Durer knows it. So why is wire so important? All of these other things are made with wire. Nails, pins, fishing hooks, bird cages, sieves. Like, wire was critical to life in around 1500. And we have all this evidence of it. So when Durer made the watercolor, he was essentially showing us the site of this wire production. And when he made the woodcut knots, he was showing us like his own version of making wire. It was a kind of, he was kind of a show-offy artist. Like this was a real show of his ingenuity. So the other thing about him making these knots as woodcuts instead of as engravings, and those of you who have made woodcuts know this. So the white lines here aren't inked. They are created from the gouged lines and spaces on the block. Well, the pressure of the print actually pushes the paper down into those lines. So those lines in impressions that haven't been washed are embossed. And so you get the feel of the same feel that you would get from the wire filigree that's sitting on the top of that tray in a woodcut. Now, we talked in the earlier panel about one's bodily relationship to prints. Too often now we see prints in frames and museum cases, but in 1500, during Durer's time, they were in albums, they were being passed around. There wasn't as much prohibition about rubbing your fingers over the surface of them. I mean, they were just paper. And I think that that was a really important aspect of understanding them. And so Durer has embedded the physicality of these bowls in these prints. Another reason, of course, that wire is important is that it's necessary to make paper. So the better the quality of the paper got in Nuremberg, the better the quality of the wire got in Nuremberg, the better the quality of these paper molds was. So with really thin wires, paper makers were able to make much finer paper. And I'm going to spare you my explanation of paper making. But believe me. So it just so happens that the first paper mill in Northern Europe, above the Alps, is right outside the gates of Nuremberg. So this is a depiction of Nuremberg from the Nuremberg Chronicle, which is 1494 or 1493, I can never remember. And in the bottom right, the building outside the gate is in fact a paper mill. So it's all of this industry contributes to Durer's knowledge of what he's making. And here are two pieces of paper so that you can see how important wire is to paper. So paper is made with these molds that have chain and laid lines, and so you get the pattern of those lines in a piece of paper. Paper makers would take another piece of wire and make a shape from it, bend it into a shape, attach it, so that you could see that design as well, so that you could always identify who made the paper. And it's how we identify paper, where it was made, what date it was made, and all of that. So we know a lot about paper from these, what we call watermarks, but they should really more appropriately be called wire marks. So when Durer makes a print like the knots, and it's really unfortunate that this doesn't show very well, but you can see the lines of wire of the knot. This is a beta radiograph made at the National Gallery of Victoria from the knots. They did an amazing thing with their Durer collection in terms of picturing them and digitizing them. But you can see the registers of the lines of the knot, the lines of the paper, as well as the watermark. So this is what's happening in these prints, I think. Durer has decided to copy this Muslim art form to capture its physicality, to demonstrate the trade in natural resources and luxury artisanal goods that's happening in the region that Nuremberg is a huge part of. And through his great skill to give you a physical representation of that, all of that networking. And I'm going to end with this kind of little tongue-in-cheek joke. So this is a portrait of Durer that was made by his compatriot Erhard Schern in the year that Durer died. In the upper left corner of the woodcut is Durer's coat of arms. But you could see the wire mark from the paper there in Durer's hair. It's the coat of arms of Nuremberg. And so Nuremberg's industry, its paper, its metal industries, like all of this is part of his material imagination, which somehow Erhard Schern has managed to capture in this woodcut. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was brilliant. I'm going to ask you the first question. You spoke a lot about technique. And so to what extent you as a curator handling prints, has that affected your thinking about prints and your scholarship? I've just mentioned one personal thing, that in college, what inspired me to get into prints was the passing around of a Durer engraving in class. And so tell us how it's affected your thinking about prints.
It's an interesting question, David. I went to graduate school in the age when we were all being trained in critical theory, continental French theory. And so I did the first few years of graduate school working on prints using Xeroxes. And I had an advisor, Christiane Herdel, who I was about to go off and do my dissertation research in Europe, and she said to me, "You can't go. She said, "You don't know anything about prints. Like, you have to go to a museum and learn something about something that's not a Xerox." And she twisted my arm, and I applied for an internship at the Harvard Art Museums, and I became Jerry Cohn's intern, and I found the handling of these objects extraordinary. How much more information I got from the objects because I could touch them. Feel the way that the ink is raised on them, feel the edge of the block or the plate. And I think so much is lost that we show them in frames now. I ended up becoming the curator at Harvard, and I would teach a class with undergraduates in which we passed around the prints, and because I thought it was the only way to really introduce them to those extraordinary objects and everything you learn that way.
Thank you. Any questions from anybody out there? Yes, please.
Thank you for the amazing talk. I wanted to ask sort of general question, maybe not specifically about the knots, but you spoke about him seeing Bellini's painting, but I wonder if you could make a comment about where Durer got his information from, what he's learning from, whether that's, let's say, what's happening in Constantinople or in Istanbul, where he's understanding around the mathematics of the knots, where's that coming from? And then in a corollary, did he view the creation and distribution of his prints as as disseminating information, or did he view that more as the creation of art?
They're really good questions. So Durer started making prints and drawings that included Muslim figures and themes after he went to Venice for the first time. And I think his travel to Venice changed his worldview. he had traveled in his training, and he had gone to different German and Austrian cities where there were printers and publishing houses. But I think going to Venice introduced him to the sea, and the sea connected all of these other places. And of course, Venice is one of the great just intercontinental sites for the exchange of ideas and objects and all of it. Many early printed books of the late 15th century, ones that he worked on, in fact, Sebastian Brandt's Narrenschiff, the Nuremberg Chronicle, contain a lot of information about the Islamic world. So he could have picked it up in books. I think, when one travels, one meets a lot of different kinds of people. And I think he got a lot in that way. And because a lot of it was chance encounters, and it's not all recorded, but he can't have known what he knew without encountering it in some way. So when he was going to Venice, Venice was the launch point for pilgrimages to the Holy Land. So all of these Europeans would gather in Venice, get on this boat, go to Alexandria, go to Damascus, go up and down the coast there, and then come back through Venice. So, there were all kinds of stories circulating about the Eastern Mediterranean there. I think that he was a gatherer of stories. And I think a lot of his prints, hold these stories that are no longer familiar to us. And so, it's hard for us to determine the meaning because we don't know the background. He was very interested in selling those prints. He had agents that he hired to travel from city to city and sell them, and his wife and mother sold them at the Frankfurt Book Fair. So a lot of his income came through the sale of prints. In fact, there's a moment in which he writes that he regrets ever making altarpieces by commission because, he can't get the payment from the rich guy who commissioned it, and he should just be selling prints anyway. But
Sorry, go ahead.
But I also think because so much of his patrons in Nuremberg and elsewhere are in the metal industries, making those knots is kind of a souvenir for them too. His nod to, I know you're trading in metal. I'm kind of trading in metal too. The whole town's trading in metal. So.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Following up on your answer I was interested in, obviously he was a successful artist financially, but in general, who were his clients? How expensive was it to buy a Dürer print at that time? And the common people couldn't afford it, right? So who was his client base? And what was the market like? I can't imagine a show like this in 1454 where people can come. Yeah.
Well, he's making prints at all different levels of the print economy. He's making broadsheets, woodcuts with text on them. For instance, one that explains how you get syphilis because of the alignment of the stars. Something like that would have sold much more inexpensively than an engraving like Melancholia or Saint Jerome. But, a lot of they were being printed in the hundreds. And while they weren't available to, those who were just getting by, they were part of an economy of the middle class, the bourgeois, and certainly a lot of these merchants and others in town. And they were sold internationally. They weren't only being sold in Germany, they were being brought to other countries in Europe to be sold.
Anything else? One last question to you, Susan, coming from me again. Have you thought about an exhibition of Durer and his contemporaries? Who else was out there making subjects of Islamic, using Islamic sources? And what about an exhibition to tell us more?
This project actually, I started thinking about this project originally as an exhibition. And I would actually love to do it as an exhibition somewhere because I think that there's a lot that can be shown, both, a lot of the relationship between the Islamic art and the European art is very clear in lots of cases. So if anyone here works at a museum that would like to see this show, call me.
Thank you very much. That was terrific. Brilliant. Thank you.